Hey guys, this video is a little different than all the projects on the channel, and we got more projects coming. Um, and the reason I haven't done a ton of videos on projects, I would love to have done a lot more, but we had something going on in my life, and I mentioned it in some other videos. But our youngest son, um, this past Tuesday on February 20th. Um, Lost his battle to pediatric brain cancer. Um, he passed away peacefully on Tuesday with my wife and I with him, and got to say goodbye to his brother. And we have his memorial service this weekend. And I wanted to make this video because he was diagnosed ultimately right after we finished this house. And if you look through the videos, you'll see all the videos of the house build. Just in September, we moved in this house in July, and in September, he started having health issues, all of a sudden, neurological issues, and ultimately was diagnosed with a grade 4 diffuse midline glioma, or DMG. Diffuse means it's like an infiltrating tumor. It's like tentacles, like grows like a web of basically it's not a mass. It's a web of tentacles. And midline means it's in the middle of the brain. His started on his thalamus, and then spread to his cerebellum, and then ultimately, before he passed, it spread down his spine. And then glioma is the type of tumor it is, which affects the glial cells in the brain. It is a mutation of the glial cells in the brain. And a DMG is what it's called. There's also a subtype of DMG called a DIPG. And in most cases, a DMG is fatal. And in his case, it was fatal. The average lifespan for a kid, and typically these things only affect children. It can happen in adults, but it's actually pretty rare in adults. Most adults do not get DMG or DIPG. And a DIPG, by the way, is a diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which means it's basically the same thing, but it's on the pons, which is essentially your brainstem, and controls your bodily functions. And ultimately, that's what kind of made Carter pass, is he lost control, lost the ability to swallow, and lost the ability to cough voluntarily. And then his kind of mucus secretions that normal people can just swallow and deal with throughout the day started to build up, and then got into his lungs and aspirated, and we had to put him on a ventilator to keep his lungs clear, and that was it at that point. But I'm not going to get into too much about that. But what I wanted to make this video about is how do we fight this terrible disease, and how do we find a cure for this terrible disease and childhood brain cancer, so that other parents don't have to deal with the death of their children like we did. It's terrible to, we gave Carter the best life that we could give him, and we spent a lot of quality family time, and it puts a lot of things into perspective. And he was a fantastic kid, and just always positive. Anyone who asked him just always had a smile on his face. He was a little mischievous kid too. He had no fear of anything, and he just lived life to the fullest. And for someone, this terrible disease to happen to someone, he had the right kind of personality for that, because he fought it and he loved superheroes. He was a superhero through this whole thing, because he had the right mindset, personality, and not to say it wasn't tough on him, and he had his depressing moments, but he really fought this hard. And we went through countless rounds of chemotherapy, and we did radiation. We just started our second round of radiation when we found out it was in progression, but it was just too little, too late. And he really fought this hard, and a lot of kids, fight this hard, and unfortunately, the conundrum here with this is and that's what the purpose of this video is. I'm going to talk about this, is that in these diseases, um, especially this one, they're so fast that there's a few problems. When companies are developing cures and drugs to fight this, it's extremely expensive. I mean, it's millions, if not billions of dollars. It's a lot of money to fight these things and develop these drugs and go through the trials and the tests. And the problem is this particular type of cancer is so aggressive that a lot of times they don't finish the trials because the child passes away. And then also, the FDA, in many cases, wants these things tested in adults before kids. Well, the problem is with DIPG and DIPG, it's extremely, extremely rare in adults. I mean, it can happen in adults, but in most cases, it affects children. So when these companies are trying to develop these drugs, and there was one particular drug that we were very, very interested in, and unfortunately, it did not get approval for the trial before he passed, but it had been submitted, and it'll get approval like literally any day now. But this particular drug, the FDA was pushing this gentleman. I've been in communication with him. It was a small lab, and he had lost his wife to glioblastoma, and he was developing a drug to fight glioblastoma, which in many cases is fatal to adults. He realized that this drug was more effective against DMG and DIPG, so he was pushing very, very hard to get this out for kids because he'd rather save a child's life than an adult's life. All life is precious, but to save a kid's life is even more important. And he wanted this to be trialed for kids. He wanted to find a cure for this disease for kids. He was doing this all out of just giving back. He didn't have to do any of this, and in this case, the FDA was pushing him to trial this in adults. And he's like, well, this doesn't affect adults. So like, how would we trial in, 3 adults a year? Like, that's silly, So ultimately, I think he was finally successful in, doing a child trial. But the problem is that it's a relatively rare disease. And when you have to run these trials, there's not a lot of kids that are affected by this. And so you have a very small pool of people, a very small pool of data to run these trials, right? And then the whole process to get approval for this is a very long and arduous process. So a lot of the larger companies don't even want to put the effort into developing drugs for this because it's just, they're spending so much money to do this to then, the trials sometimes don't work. And in developing these drugs, and this is not a video about Big Pharma and against Big Pharma. Big Pharma's done some great things and they've done some terrible things. This isn't a video about that, but at the end of the day, these pharmaceutical companies raise, whether small labs or big labs or whatever, a lot of times these drugs are developed by smaller labs, and then the big pharmaceutical companies buy out the rights to these products and basically pay the owner of it because they have the capital to do that. But they spend and risk millions, tens of millions, if not billions of dollars to develop these groundbreaking new drugs. In fact, one of the drugs that Carter was taking and it kept him stable for a long time was a drug that's been around now for 10 years. He was on a drug called Tagrisso, which is very common in people who have lung cancer. And we determined, basically through scientific developments that have occurred within the last 10 years, which is the DNA sequencing through the CRISPR sequencing, we determined that his tumor had a specific mutation that was treatable through this particular drug, Tagrisso. And he was on that drug. He took it every single day. It's an inhibitor, and it did keep him stable. In fact, when he passed, his brain tumor was still stable. It did not grow. But the tumor had spread somewhere else, and we're awaiting. We've donated his brain and his spine to scientific research, and we're waiting kind of the test results back to determine if maybe there was another mutation and that's why it spread. We don't really know yet, but we you know, we were on this drug, and this drug had been around for 10 years, and AstraZeneca was the developer of this drug, and it's helped a lot of people with lung cancer, lots and lots of people. And so these companies develop all these things, and it requires a lot of investment, and their investors, they raise money from investors. And look, I'm in the real estate business. I raise money to buy real estate deals, and I promise my investors a return on their investment on their real estate deals. That's what I do for a living. And so it's the same concept. You're raising money to develop something, and in hopes that it does pay off, and that you can pay your investors back and give them a return on their investment, because they're risking and fronting, their own hard-earned money to fund these sort of things. So I've got nothing against that, but these particular things, take time and effort and development and risk to develop. And if you have a very small pool from just a ROI standpoint, it doesn't look promising. So the only way that these small labs and these doctors and these research places come up with the money for these things is through grants from foundations. And I will be starting a foundation in Carter's honor. I plan on doing that here in the next few months. And there are a lot of other great foundations for this particular disease. You have the Cure Starts Now. We've donated a lot of money. We've helped them raise money. Cure Starts Now is a fantastic organization. And a lot of the people who work for Cure Starts Now are parents whose kids have passed from this terrible disease, and they are giving back and helping to give back to find a cure. And they raise money, and then they use that money, and they give that money through grants to these small labs that are developing these groundbreaking cures for these diseases, so that other parents don't have to go through what we went through. We're giving back, and I plan on giving back. My foundation I want to support. I only want to fund sort of out of the box research. I want to fund out of the box ideas because that's the only way we find cures for these diseases. Is we've got to think outside of the box, and we've got to focus on other things. And I have no history in the medical world whatsoever, but that's how we find cures for these diseases. So if you want to give money and you want to help give back, give money to Cure Starts Now, or there's another organization that's helped us. Chad Tuff is another great organization. There's a local organization here that helped us out, gave us some Christmas money for the kids, and we didn't need it. We don't need the money. My wife and I, we do well, but they had lost their son to DIPG, and they created a foundation, and I plan on doing that. And all these small foundations, large and small, they raise money to give to these small labs, because otherwise they wouldn't get funding. They wouldn't get investor money, because the promise of an ROI for them is almost next to nothing. So they get their money through grants from these foundations. And so if you want to help, give money to these foundations. That's where these labs that develop these groundbreaking things, that's where they get their money from, is through these foundations. Also, I would encourage you, and I'll put a link to all this in the description, but there is a bill before Congress right now, which is called the Promising Pathway Act. I would encourage you to read it. There are videos about there. In fact, there's a fantastic video from one of the founders of Cure Starts Now, where he's testifying before Congress and talking about this terrible disease. The problem right now is that you have a compassionate use sort of protocol, but there's not enough time, especially in such an aggressive disease that our son had. The rules basically dictate that you can't petition for compassionate use of a particular drug until you've seen progression in most cases. And the problem is once you've entered progression, there's not that much time. We started noticing signs of progression in our son around the first week of January, and then 6 weeks later he passed away. And typically speaking, the time to get to petition for compassionate use and all of that can take upwards of 2 months to get approval. And the drug that we were interested in getting compassionate use was one that still hadn't been approved yet. I had already spoken to the CEO of that small company, that small pharmaceutical company that had developed this drug, and he had already agreed. He said, as soon as we get approval from the FDA, you can apply for compassionate use. But it was still going to be another 2 months before we could get approved for that to try this groundbreaking new drug. And guess what? And I know this sounds morbid, but we already know what the alternative is. And that's what the Promising Pathway Act is about. It's for people with terminal illnesses to allow a quicker process and allow more access to groundbreaking new drugs that might help or they might not. But at the end of the day, even if they don't help, we already knew what the alternative was. This is a no-brainer, right? You're willing to try and do whatever it takes to help save your child's life or save your spouse's life. Also with the Promising Pathway Act, a lot of people with ALS testified. And in our son's case, and in many cases with ALS, cognitively, our son's brain tumor did not affect him at all. He was, all there mentally. It was all physiological issues with him. And so, obviously he's a kid and he can't consent, but he was perfectly aware of everything that was going on, and his brain tumor did not affect him cognitively at all. Some kids, their brain tumors does affect them cognitively, but in his case, it didn't. And in many cases with the DMG, DIPG, it doesn't affect kids cognitively, only affects them physically. So if you're looking to do something and make a difference in this, tell your congressperson to vote yes for the Promising Pathway Act. It's a no-brainer. It doesn't cost any money. That bill does not cost any money. It's a no-brainer. So tell your congressperson to vote yes for that. And also, if you want to give money and you want to help save children's lives, give money to these small foundations and these small organizations like Cure Starts Now or Chad Tough, to help fight these terrible diseases, because the only way that these labs that develop these groundbreaking drugs get the funding to develop these things is from grants, because they're, from an ROI perspective, it's just not there. So the big pharmaceutical companies don't invest in it. It's way too risky. And I get it. I don't have anything against the pharmaceutical companies in that standpoint. It's just a business decision at the end of the day. So the only way to get it funded is through small organizations. And I know I keep repeating myself, but I felt like it was important to make this video. This is helpful in my part of the grieving process. Now I feel like it's important for me to pay it forward and help other families and help parents and help these kids and help find a cure for this terrible disease. So that other parents don't have to go through what me and my wife and my oldest son went through, watching our son, struggle and fight this disease and ultimately succumb to it. So I wanted to make this video today. I know it's a little bit different. It's not a project, but I am doing it in my shop here, and I've gotten some cool projects coming soon, but I felt like it was important to make this video. So thanks for watching. Do what you can. I'll put links there in the link, and hopefully we can help find a cure for this terrible disease. So thanks again, guys. Have a great day. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.